Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopoulos Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good morning and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Annie Forsheimer, and I am a Senior Non-Resident Associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Both the statistics and the human stories of the ongoing tragedy in Afghanistan are staggering. The cash shortages, inflation, and currency depreciation have led to a banking system collapse, which in turn has created a severe food and medical crisis. With import disruptions, a looming famine, and the reality that hospitals cannot maintain staff or supplies. The UN estimates 1 million children are at mortal risk. As parents, how could we possibly turn away from what that means? We would have a moral obligation to intervene even if we didn't bear some responsibility for the situation, which we do. We also have strategic interests in doing this, given the risk of regional instability caused by Afghanistan's implosion. Of course, Taliban leaders bear the biggest responsibility of all through their brutal takeover and continued abrogation of basic human rights, including their use of extrajudicial killings against former US allies, and their suspension of women's rights to education and work. In the face of sanctions and aid suspension, they are refusing to do what is necessary to restart international support, and the Afghan people are needlessly suffering. The US and the international community are left with extremely difficult choices. Beyond deploying humanitarian aid through private organizations and the United Nations, leaders must make decisions regarding the twin issues of Afghanistan's cash reserves, essential for supporting its currency, and multilateral and bilateral development assistance. I'm pleased today to moderate an excellent panel to help us consider next steps. Jason Chung, a senior advisor here at CSIS, had an extensive career in state and federal government, including in Congress, before serving as the US director with rank of ambassador at the Asian Development Bank from 2018 to 2021. Catherine, or Katie Striffolino, has worked for many prestigious organizations at the forefront of humanitarian and human rights activism, including the International Rescue Committee and Amnesty International. She now supervises interactions, field research, analysis, and collective action to support humanitarian response, operations, and policy. Dr. Mohammed Salim Omaid just started his career with Azizi Bank in 2006 and became its president and CEO just over a decade later. He is a respected leader in Afghanistan's private sector as chair of the Afghanistan Banking Association and the Banking Commission of the International Chamber of Commerce. And joining us for a short while in between obligations, we have Gul Maqsood Sabit, a former Afghan Deputy Minister of Finance for Revenue and Customs. Welcome to our panelists. So I have an opening question for each of you. Finding a solution to this crisis means arriving at a mix of policy considerations and, unfortunately, making some impossible choices among considerations. Some of those considerations are the level of political and security risk the international community is willing to accept regarding funds that may fall into Taliban hands, the urgency of the problem afflicting millions of innocent people, the responsibility to use our limited leverage to oblige the Taliban to respect basic human rights, the importance of using government institutions to deliver assistance rather than lose the progress that has been made so far in building a civil service, and the crucial role of free private sector in pushing back some Taliban abuses. So there are many ways to calibrate these, of course. For example, some who are so concerned about the situation's urgency may be willing to take greater risks that the Taliban would gain unconditional access to Afghanistan's assets or international funding. Before we all talk about the details of how we might achieve a solution, could I ask each of you to tell me, what do you consider the 2 or 3 most important policy considerations to bear in mind? So let me please start with you, Jason.
Annie, thank you so much. And I look forward to hearing from the other panelists, their thoughts and their views on this most important subject. I think first, before I answer the question, I think what's needed is you need a political process by which those difficult decisions and difficult policy choices are going to be made, which includes getting the right mix of people making these decisions at the highest level of governments, at the highest level of international organizations. And unfortunately, those require political appointees. And so when you have those types of people making decisions, and that's not to say that you don't have caring, qualified civil servants assisting in this decision-making process, but the hard decisions will need to be made in this topic. I think first and foremost, when you talk about these things, you got to figure out what the risk appetite, as well as the risk adversity in governments and in international organizations. And the decision has to be made that we need to potentially look the other way on risk. I think from the October G20 virtual meeting, the Afghan financial crisis that's going on right now, the G20 agreed that this is a major concern. But I think what's lack of progress in addressing those issues, I think is a grave concern. So I think part of the thing is, it's like one of the major policy considerations I would like to see right now is potentially on electricity, on energy issues, because I think if there's a way that you can help the individuals on the ground, the Afghan people who are going into winter, get electricity and access to energy resources to protect them from the harsh winters, I think that's one policy area that can be adhered to through the multilaterals, through international finance institutions. But mostly, the UN has to decide if they're going to recognize, and I personally don't think they should, but I think that's going to be the major policy consideration in the short term for the global community.
Thank you so much. Katie.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Annie. So, first, just a +1, Jason, to your point about getting critical nominations through, we can feel that gap. And so just thanks for raising that, and just a +1 on that. I'm just want to preview a bit of the forthcoming humanitarian response plan numbers, which underscores Annie's point about how dire the situation is. It's even more dire, which really underscores, this is against the backdrop of the policy recommendations I'm going to make, which is urgent action is needed now. So we're looking at 23 million people, which is about half of the total population of Afghanistan, facing high or extremely high levels of food insecurity. That's including 1.1 million children under 5 facing the risk of acute malnutrition. And UN estimates are that in 2020, if no action is taken, up to 131,000 children could die due to starvation in the year ahead. Now, these deaths are entirely preventable if action is taken now. So just thanks to CSIS for organizing this super timely discussion, and I'm really looking forward to what other panelists have to say. So my first policy consideration, and this is again kind of linked to one of the points that Jason made, is look, Afghanistan is a high-risk environment, like Syria, like Yemen, like Ethiopia, and all other contexts in which humanitarian actors operate. We have strong due diligence mechanisms built into our machinery, built into the system to mitigate against waste, fraud, abuse, as well as aid diversion and manipulation by stakeholders, including authorities and non-governmental actors. So really the first policy consideration I'll throw out there is, do policymakers, governments, and other institutions care more about maintaining a zero tolerance approach to risk with regards to engaging the de facto authorities, or do they trust their partners' due diligence mechanisms? And are they willing to take on some risk sharing of their own so 131,000 children don't die of starvation in the year ahead? So my message here is get your policy priorities straight. There's no matter of policy fixes that can make up for lives lost. Now, my second policy consideration is, look, at the topic of this discussion today, Afghanistan, as we know, are facing significant liquidity challenges. There are neither Afghanis nor US dollars available in the banking system. With so little currency in the banks, in addition to the halting of the international financial institution engagement with the Afghan banking sector, it's made it extremely difficult even for international wire transfers, as we all know. However, unlocking the banking cash liquidity problem set will be all for nothing unless there are more sufficient and robust legal safeguards built into domestic and multilateral sanctions programs to ensure humanitarian actors, financial institutions, businesses are able to safely operate and conduct business to serve the needs of the affected populations. So we can get into what those specifics would look like in a bit, but just to say we do need more legal protection because all the cash in the world will be all for none if we actually can't use it legally. Thirdly, NGOs, local, particularly national, particularly and international, we require seats at the table alongside policymakers and institutions who are developing policy and solutions. And we should be actively consulted with in a transparent manner to ensure programs and policies align with the best interests and needs of the affected Afghan population. As folks are well aware, the NGO community, local, national, and international, comprise the bulk of frontline responders. And they're oftentimes comprised of community members themselves. And so these NGOs, if direct dialogue with affected communities to learn and listen about their wishes, their hopes for the future, and what they would like in terms of support is not possible, then you need the NGOs at the table to make sure that things are in alignment. I will say that right now, engagement with the NGO community across the board is quite ad hoc. We're seeing a lot of different solutions and ideas kind of put forward, but quite frankly, they're not practical, they're not implementable, and they're missing the mark. And we're wasting time as a result. So the solution here is to make sure the NGOs are at the table, representing the perspectives of the affected population and also guiding in terms of what's practically possible at the field level. So just engage the NGOs more would be the third policy recommendation. I'll stop there.
So much for that. Dr. Omaid, what would you say are the main policy considerations that we should be thinking about? Just make sure you're no longer on mute. There we go.
Thank you very much. I have to correct one thing for the audience. The Afghan banking system has not collapsed. I have to correct the topic of today's event. But the Afghan banking system is active but restricted, restricted with resources and restricted with for so many other reasons. But I can tell that if certain steps are not taken at time, this may lead to the collapse of the banking sector. So I just wanted to clarify this, that the banking sector is still alive in Afghanistan. On the policy consideration, I would just, my fellows and the panel, they have spoken very well. I would like to just conclude what they have said. Number one, we have to take calculative risks and we have to release some of the amounts which are frozen. We have to do this, number one. Number two, we have to inject funds into the banking system. Whatever funds are released or whatever aids are done to Afghanistan, this has to be through banking system. And then only you will have the transparency, and then you will have the reporting. And then you will be able to mitigate the risks. And my last thing in summary, which my fellow panelist said, there should be some activities started. The only solution is not that the funds are released, aids are continued, but if there is no activities, economic activities in the country, at some moment of time, again, we will be failed. So the government machinery has to start, and from the international institutions, from international agencies like World Bank, IFC, ADB, they have to start and they have to, support the projects which are done, which are in the phase to be completed, and those projects funds are blocked because we have blocked the aid funds to Afghanistan. So that has to be started to some extent, and that has to be done through the banking sector. This issue has further jeopardized the lives of the banks in Afghanistan, because we see that there are borrowers. We have given, the banks have given the loans, and their borrowers, they are the vendors for these projects. They have completed the projects, and now their funds are stuck, and they are not able to pay the loans back to the banks. So this on one side has created the liquidity issue. On the other side, it has created the issue for the bottom line and the capital of the banks. So these were the three main important policies and items to be reconsidered. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ahmed, and I appreciate your clarification. Deputy Minister Sabit, could you please answer the same question about the considerations? And mindful of your time, I may ask you the first separate question as well.
Thank you very much, Annie, for having me and for the opportunity to be here. And I'm sorry I was a minute late because my other program did not end on time. Just a few very important things. I think our friends here touched on the most important issues, but I would like to summarize a couple of things here. First of all, I think it's very important to consider engagement with the Taliban in the interest of protecting the gains that were achieved as a result of significant investment in the country over the last 20 years. There's one thing, and I'm not really alluding to recognition here, but I'm just talking about engagement. And there is no other way. If we look, what's other alternative other than not engaging? The second thing that's very important is aid must not be conditional on the political conditions on the ground, because we're dealing with a population of 38 million, and then punishing them for what the leadership in the government now does is probably not a good idea. And in the meantime, alongside urgent aid that's rightly needed, I think we have to think about how to maintaining the institutions instead of killing them by creating parallel structures. And how do we use those institutions in place, and also reinvesting or restarting projects such as NSP and other projects that provide livelihoods and earning opportunities for the common population. There were some great programs such as, again, NSP, Sehat Mandi, and others like women empowerment, some program where there was help provided to women at home who worked at home. Do not forget that there is about 8 million people who can work, actually, who are eligible to work, and 5.7 million of those are women who are not active, unfortunately. So we have to think along those lines, in addition to the urgent need that's needed right away. And then just the last thing, I don't want to take too much time here. I think the international community should take a bold decision on a mechanism to deliver aid in funneling money, aid money, and also as a result helping revive the economy. There are certain, I think, options on the table. A few proposals are there, including one of my proposal. I'm not sure if you have seen it, but I think the international community has to come together and make a bold decision. I know there are certain people, certain groups, and nobody wants to take an opportunity, but I propose a group of experts and representatives from different organizations that includes World Bank, even Treasury, U.S. Treasury Department, CSIS, and World Bank, IMF, all of them to come together, look at those proposals and pick one of them or a combination of them, and then say, this is how we are going to go. Because we spend so much time on discussing the problem and alternatives, but we are not making much progress in making it happen. So
thank you.
Thank you
all very much. And I think the next part of our discussion, we will try to dig into a few of those proposed solutions. What I'm hearing overall, first of all, is the urgency is very real. The need to accept risk is very important. The importance of using existing institutions wherever possible, the banking system, rather than develop a set of parallel institutions, and getting more people around the table. I think those are common themes so far. Deputy Minister, when we talk about the idea of alternatives to, say, the central bank's role in currency exchange, what would you say are the pros and cons of a private mechanism, which some have suggested, for dollar auctions or other mechanisms? And do you think would hoarding or siphoning take place if there were greater liquidity? Would the Taliban be in a position to take control of private accounts? And really, what safeguards, and this is something Dr. May can also probably speak to very well, what safeguards are in place for anti-money laundering or terrorist finance concerns?
Okay. There's a very good question, and I think part of that is happening right now on the ground too. Well, the best part of this is that some aid is making it to the country. Through a private bank and a private mechanism that has been talked about. That's probably one of the pros and the only one I can think of at this time. But there are a number of cons to this, and let me go through a few of them real quick. First of all, this is, nothing can replace the function of a central bank. And I think many of us know that it's very difficult to do what central bank does through a private institution, especially one that is, or a private bank that is in competition with others in the sector. And there are a number of players who compete with each other. And you give the responsibility to one of them. So that parallel structure will also actually undermine the progress that has been made at the central bank. There's one negative. Second, the banking law does not allow that actually. There is no such thing. So you have to kind of, go against the law too. Second, the third one is central banks, monetary policy is actually connected to cash and to any cash activities that, auctions and others. So if we give this a job to a private bank, then of course, how do you connect that with the overall monetary policy of the country? For example, if you inject cash through the bank, who collects the the money back? If we go with the former system, who collects the AFS back? So there are actually issues that needs to be resolved with this, and I'm not clear on that, how they're doing that. Supervision, how does a private bank supervise other banks? Okay. Now, liquidity issue, there will be hoarding, and there will be a problem with, one bank will have enough liquidity, and then it will kill the financial sector actually, because many of these customers, everybody will move to that bank, okay, and there will be no competition. That bank, like now, according to some reports that I don't have confirmation of it, is they're charging 15% for these deliveries of aid money. And then UN, unfortunately, have their own charges. Their headquarters charge 15%, and then I think their office in Kabul charges 15%. So what's left for the people on the ground? So since it's one private bank, they can do whatever they want because there's the only place. Now, and then I don't want to take too much time on this one, but coming to the second question of working with the Taliban, or what can we do to avoid their interference in the private banks? Actually, the situation right now on the ground is such that it's in their best interest not to do that. Okay, but again, the thing is, you cannot really predict anything. Okay, anything can happen. So the right solution or the right way would be, since there is no law that they abide by, it's actually a group decision, and usually these announcements made by the supreme leaders, usually there's the law. So I think it would be a good thing for UNAMA to work with them and kind of secure a decree through their supreme leader, directing them not to interfere with private accounts. And I think they have the incentive to do that because they see the situation in the country. I think they will be more inclined to do such a thing from what I hear on the ground. And I'm sure Mr. Omed can tell us more about that. So I think that would be one thing. Other than that, I think our banking sector is well equipped with the right rules and regulations for AML CFT concerns. They have good measures in place. I think those ought to be used, but a mechanism that will inject or that will funnel aid money through all these banking sectors to the economy, to the livelihood projects, and also aid would really keep the banking sector alive. So I think it has to be done through all banking, keeping competition alive, and then reviving the economy through these banks. I hope that answers the question.
No, thank you very much. I do understand you have another obligation, so I really appreciate your intervention and your participation today.
Thank you.
Dr. Ahmed, if I could follow up with you, and in particular, and any of the topics that were just raised, but also that you referred to a limited release of some of, I assume you mean the national reserves. Could you please amplify that?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I definitely agree with the respected Deputy Minister. But the thing is that we have to compromise on some of the things, like he was referring to the banking law. There are things, the central bank is responsible for the monetary policy as well as for the supervision of the banks. So the supervision of the banks will definitely remain with the central bank, and no private bank will be intervening in that. And some part of the monetary policy will be transferred to a bank. And see, there is another solution. There are solutions which we have seen practically in the last some days. UNDP, they are receiving funds, and those funds are given to a private bank, but in some part there is an involvement of the central bank as well, and this involvement is not affecting the AML related matters. So that is very clear. I don't want to speak about that mechanism because I will be taking your much of time. So that can happen. That can be continued, number one. Number two, on the monopoly side, see, one bank is receiving the funds But the good thing is that the beneficiaries are not with one bank. The beneficiaries are spread all over the private commercial banks. So the moment they receive the funds, those funds are distributed among the banks. And then those banks are distributing funds to the beneficiaries as per the list of the UN agencies, whether it is WFP, WHO, UNICEF, and others. So, I mean, there are mechanisms which can be worked out, and we can solve the solution. I mean, it's a very limited part of the central bank responsibility that is going to be taken over by the by a private bank. The private bank will not be responsible. I told you that the funds which they receive is received by the private bank, and immediately at that time this is given back to the central bank, because that much of funds cannot be kept in the vaults of a private bank. This is not secured, and then those funds can be very much utilized, I mean, for the inflation and the depreciation, for the monetary policies matters. I can explain from the AML's perspective as well, if somebody is concerned on this part. So, see, we repeat that the country is currently facing one of the world's worst humanitarian crisis, and something has to be done. People are, they have to come out to the street selling whatever they have for a piece of bread. So in such a situation, certain compromises can be happen, and with some calculated risk approach. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You know, if I may turn to you, Jason, what kind of solutions, as Dr. Ahmed and others have mentioned, you know, there are these now one-off solutions or smaller scale solutions. What kind of solutions that are currently under consideration for restarting the economy might be scaled up to a meaningful level in a country this large?
I think Dr. Ahmed alluded to one with UNDP funding mechanism going to the central banking into financial institutions. You know, I think one thing needs to be made clear is that the World Bank and international organizations and donors have released about $280 million, which needs to be more, and I think they'll get there for humanitarian, food, medical relief, and I think that's a start, and I think that's one consideration, one policy consideration, or to start taking care of people on the ground. And you know, I think the deputy minister alluded to or noted that, you know, women in the workforce. I think we all can agree that women in the workforce adds to a more vibrant economy, and therefore, you know, incomes will go up. There will be more, you know, in a way, like with more people in the workforce earning incomes. Like I think the Taliban will eventually need to recognize that they need to have the women in the workforce. On another part, I think the Taliban would need to come to terms. But you know, I think one thing we're talking about is the donor community, the international community, discussing issues with the Taliban. But I also want to take that the other way around, which is the Taliban will need to figure out how to address a lot of these internal domestic concerns with the global community as well. I think they're starting to realize governing is really hard. You know, Annie, you and I both know governing in the US system is sometimes a little difficult. There are challenges, but I think those who are trying, the Taliban that are trying to run a country, are figuring out that there are a lot of needs in Afghanistan, especially after 20 years of the United States being there, and so on and so forth. So I think some of the policy considerations have to start from, you know, the humanitarian aspects, and then that could open a channel to discuss other aspects, which is restarting the economy. I think part of the challenge also with restarting the economy is what are the developments with, in terms of COVID, will the Taliban need to address with their population as well? Because that is still there. And, you know, from my time at the Asian Development Bank, you know, they need COVID vaccines just like the rest of the world does. So is that part of the calculus that, you know, the previous government, now the Taliban, are considering in order to figure out how to restart any type of any type of economic activity. But I think, at some point when you discuss AML CFT, I think there are various different interlocutors, maybe proxies like the GCC, FATF to a degree that can be used as kind of a little bit of a toehold to address some of the economic concerns, and therefore open up different types of channels to discuss, a potential release of frozen funds. Again, a little bit on the harder line idea of that, but I think anything that these issues all need to be discussed as Dr. Ahmed and the Deputy Minister alluded to. So I think all these issues have to come to the table in order to figure out what type of solution, what the risk appetite is for the West and the donor countries that they're willing to kind of open up these challenges or open up these solutions for addressing the challenges on the ground.
Thank you very, very much. It does come down quite often, right? As you say, the risk appetite and then having the right people in the room. Katie, I wonder if I could ask you to elaborate, as you've started to do, what is required now and in the future for the humanitarian frontline workers to stay and deliver relief at this time of acute need?
Yeah, sure. I mean, just one overall point is, humanitarian relief, it's simply a Band-Aid. It's never a systemic solution to governance problems. And so we need development actors back in the mix pretty quickly because we can't sustain an entire population with life-saving relief. That's just not possible. On the banking, cash, and liquidity, we have experts on the line right now. The humanitarian NGO community, we've become armchair economists overnight, but this isn't our area of expertise. So we need others to do their jobs and provide as many options as possible now, and then sustainable options in the future. And we need to make sure that those options are accessible to the variety of actors working in Afghanistan now serving the people. So what we're starting to see is a bit of a privileging in terms of options being made more available to UN agencies, to bigger INGOs, however, neglecting the national and local organizations, that have been in the country for decades, that are having to close up operations because they haven't been able to pay staff, cover operational costs for, up to 6 months or some of the reporting that I have. So as many options as possible, as quickly as possible, and as inclusive as possible in terms of the cash, liquidity, and banking solutions. So that's the first point. However, as I mentioned earlier, no amount of cash and kind of financial access is going to be usable unless we secure additional safeguards. So what does that look like in the United States? That looks like, very grateful to the U.S. administration for first issuing specific licenses and then issuing general licenses through OFAC. So thanks for that. We do need more. We need expanded licensing to include education. Right now, education is not included, and as we all know, education is supporting basic human needs in Afghanistan, particularly for girls. And so we do need to see the OFAC licensing expanded. Likewise, in terms of the multilateral, the 1988 sanctions program, which is the UN Security Council sanctions program, we need a robust safeguard built into that reflects, kind of what we see within the OFAC to include education. So it's currently being negotiated in New York amongst council members, as folks are aware. In terms of what the community needs to see in that safeguard, we need it to be open-ended, so we're not relitigating this every 6, 8, 10 months. Let's learn from the Syria cross-border example. That is a nightmare, and we do not need to replicate that because that means that affected populations aren't getting the aid that they need in a timely manner. We also need to make sure that it's inclusive, protecting the range of partners, including local, national, and international organizations that are of the communities and serving the communities. And we also need realistic reporting requirements. The burden falls on the frontline actors to be doing the bulk of the data collection and the documentation in terms of these compliance and kind of reporting mechanisms. We need those to be as seamless, as efficient, and as least burdensome as possible. Otherwise, again, we're going to risk a complete paralysis in terms of the response, because everyone's too busy trying to put their due diligence points in, and they're not able to be out in the communities serving them. Another consideration, and this has been raised, but I really want to make it very strongly and clearly, is about the equitable participation and support for women in response efforts, and women as equitable members of society in terms of human rights. What we're going to see is, if women are not permitted or otherwise not supported in terms of safety to be an equitable partner in response efforts, we're going to start to see services not reaching women, because oftentimes in the context like Afghanistan, same gender is providing providing medical services to same gender, and without women in the workforce, where does that leave us? Really only serving half of the country's population, and that's really wrong. And then lastly, and this goes kind of to my earlier urgency point, we need more political will, and we need better political will by governments and other institutions to act urgently now. We need everyone, frankly, to get over this really unrealistic expectation in terms of zero tolerance. That's delusional. Afghanistan is a high-risk environment. We need to take on some risk to support the affected population at their moment in critical need. So really, just to underscore, we need more collective political will to address these problems, because again, no amount of policy fixes can make up for lives lost, and that's what we're looking at right now. So I'll pause there, but those are the main ones that we really need to see right now and in the future.
Thank you very much. That's eloquent. On two things that you mentioned, as you say, there's a negotiation underway in New York in the Security Council to pass a resolution which would basically give the equivalent of our Treasury carve-outs to the sanctions, and provide a lot of important comfort for the Europeans and others who do not have the same mechanism we do. And the sanction applications are very total. So I've heard variously that reached a near final stage for a vote, and then that was broken, that the silence procedure was broken. I don't know where it stands today, but we can very much hope that that's going to go forward. And I think I'll take off from something that you talked about and others, and take one of the questions that we've gotten from the audience. And I will throw this to whoever would like to answer it. The person asks, I'm not an Afghan specialist, but I wonder how the US can assure that the Taliban will allow women's rights to education and employment before and during releasing frozen funds to it. Now, we haven't really talked about the idea of releasing frozen funds directly to the Taliban, but I think there's a belief, a real one, that if you release some of the frozen assets, you are in fact meeting a part of the Taliban's demand that they made to the US Congress in an open letter, that that they are the rightful owners of the reserves. So that's the question. How can we, and people have said you don't condition aid, but this isn't directly aid. How could the US or others assure that the Taliban would in some way observe more, operationally more improvements in women's rights, by doing this?
I'm happy to start off on that one, Annie. I mean,
Please.
Condition aid and financial conditionality is certainly a tricky one, and we wouldn't want anything to be done at the detriment of the affected population. But I mean, I think look, that first of all, we have to ask ourselves, who is the Taliban, right? Like, who are we actually talking about here? They're not a monolith, right? And so I think it's just really important to kind of recognize that in terms of looking at policy options to try to get them to better adhere to international standards. However, they are acting as the de facto authority. So, I mean, I think what we need to all start doing is really looking at how can we be encouraging, educating, and really pushing them towards benchmarks that would allow them to eventually meet their international human rights and other legal obligations. So, I mean, I think that's kind of the track that is required. But it's also the political actors and member states and others taking a stand and saying, look, this is a non-negotiable. women are equitable members of society. Women's rights are human rights, and they are entitled to have a seat at the table. They are entitled to be working and securing an income. And these are fundamental human rights. And so I think that's kind of the approach and the direction that I would recommend. Kind of how successful that would be. I mean, it would require a lot more thought.
Thank you very much. Jason?
To be ever so basic kind of about, I think, these are points of leverage that, if they crave UN recognition, if they crave additional aid funding, if they crave like access to frozen assets, these are all points of leverage. And those political actors, as Katie alluded to, need to be able to use these points to negotiate. I think on a different point, I think instead of addressing the access to frozen assets, I think internationalization, the Asian Development Bank, maybe the World Bank Group, to a degree the IMF, in a way, could they be used as independent intermediaries for assisting the financial sector, but also in a way addressing these types of issues as well, to provide some type of liquidity. I think also part of the challenge is, and maybe this is a short-term solution, but also a long-term concern, is about China's role in this. China's role in Afghanistan now. Are you going to see kind of a renminbiization of the Afghan economy? I think from a U.S. policy standpoint, that has to be part of the calculus concern in addressing these types of issues. Not to get so in the weeds or sidetracked, but I think when you look into all these issues, there's no one perfect solution for the Afghanistan that's located specifically in that country. You have Pakistan, you have India, you have concerns with India as well. You have a lot of geopolitical, concerns, and the global community, whether it be the EU, the Europeans, the US, Japan, and Australia. There's a lot of concerns that everyone shares, but they all have their specific, issues that they got to see addressed, and that's going to make it a little bit more complicated. But I think the international community, whether it's through the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank Group, even the International Monetary Fund, they can provide, they may not like it that I'm saying this, by the way. My colleagues there, they may, my former colleagues, they may not want to take on that effort, but if not them, then who else do we have? I think that's kind of like my point. Thanks, Andy.
Thank you very much. Dr. O'May?
Thank you. No comments.
Well, then I may ask you one specific question was directed in terms of Azizi Bank, and you've answered it in general, but it said, what measures has Azizi Bank taken to mitigate the impact of what's happening? Many NGOs use Azizi services. It'd be interesting to know how solid those positions are in these tumultuous times.
Okay, from the Azizi Bank's perspective, I mean the way other banks are active with the new restrictions from the central bank, we are also operating same way. But the good thing is that if there is, I mean, the main issue is with the liquidity for these NGOs, and you, as you said, most of them are working with us. So whenever there is a fresh fund, fresh funds into the bank, into their accounts, whether it's in the form of cash or whether it's in the form of transfer, they are eligible for 100% cash, and that is provided to them. We have been very liberal. I mean, in some of the cases, we have violated the caps which are implemented by the regulator, but we have helped these NGOs for the purpose of the humanitarian activities. So there is no issue if there are fresh funds. They are eligible for 100% cash. In any part of the world, the country.
Thank you very much. A number of the questions have centered on something, that we've touched on, which is the UN's new mechanism for bringing cash into the country. If anyone is sort of wants to comment on that, is this a sign of the future, that the way that things will go, or is this something that's very, very UN specific? Can other groups basically start using it? It's almost like imagining a UN humanitarian bank in the making.
I can just offer a brief comment. It's very sensitive, as folks are aware, and it's still kind of under development. I think it's one option that's going to be helpful for some organizations. And as we said, as many options as possible, that's a good thing. However, from what we can see, this is only going to be available to a select group of qualifying organizations. That's not necessarily going to include all of the providers, including national and local NGOs and some of the INGOs that require immediate solutions now. So this is one, solution that we're very optimistic about. We're really hopeful that it is going to work out, but it's not going to be enough. It's not going to be sufficient, and it's also not going to be inclusive. And so again, we need more options, as many options as possible now. So that's all I'll say on that.
Thank you.
I would just like to add, you're very much right. But at this moment of time, seeing at the scarcity of the liquidity, I mean, for the time being, it's the best solution. The injection of physical liquidity into the banks and the beneficiaries.
Jason?
I was just gonna say that, in a way, this is like the lowest common acceptable, amount of risk that institutions can undertake using UNDP to, with these kind of, cash transfers. I think in a way there has to be a little bit of concern about leakages in that system as well. But, is there, is that an acceptable amount of risk to undertake in order to inject the local economy with financing? And I agree with Katie, at some point they got to come up with additional mechanisms to serve more underutilized communities and key actors in the country as well. And, given what we know about the bureaucratic system that the UN has, that has to be a short-term consideration. And, my problem with the UN is they don't do short-term well.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, actually might say that at this moment in time about a great number of institutions. I'm really struck by the way that you framed it, Katie, which is that the obligation on policymakers is to provide as many options as possible right now and a sustainable one for later. I would, really wish that was the one thing that people might take away from this conversation. A number of difficult choices, not perfect options, urgently required needs that have to be answered right now, with the idea of working on a sustainable solution. And the other thing I heard you and others say is that we're trying to push some benchmarks at the Taliban as the de facto authorities. The benchmarks absolutely have to do with women's rights. I think, again, the issue of extrajudicial killings cannot be ignored for, the bottom line for the international community. And then also their own compliance with the most basic anti-money laundering or terrorist finance controls. Those benchmarks have to be clear and consistent. That is essential, right? That there's one voice from the international community, or I think they will end up being able to exploit differences among the countries of the world who are offering, different ways out. So in our final few moments, I wonder if each of you could just take one more round at what you think some of the most viable options are in that first category: immediate short-term fixes, not trying to say what the longer-term sustainable one would look like. So what are your ideas? Let me maybe start with Dr. Ahmed.
I'm really sorry. I just lost you for a few seconds. Yeah, I'm really sorry. The issue may be with me only. I'm sorry.
Do you want me to rephrase the question? It is, could you just, in our last few minutes, talk about your ideas of something that would be in the category of short-term options that the policymakers need to come up with a large number of short-term options before they find the long-term and sustainable ones. So what are some of the short-term options that you suggest?
Well, if you are talking from the banking perspective and the financial system of the country, I mean the models which we have spoken about, the model which is adopted by the UN, and the model which is suggested by the Congress in the paper, we definitely, I mean, it's a time to help the people in Afghanistan. So for the time being, yes, we have to adopt the same solution and go ahead till we come up with the long-term mechanisms.
Sure, and I think with Congress, you are maybe referring to a letter signed by more than 30 representatives asking the administration to take greater urgency and to fix the problem without doing so through the Taliban authorities or recognizing them. Jason, what would be your sort of shorter term options that you might want to put into the mix?
Well, more globally speaking, I think in a way we're trying to be, perfect is the enemy of the good, or in this case, perfect is going to be the enemy of the decent, adequate thing to do for the people on the ground. As I alluded to, the donor community came up with $280 million for humanitarian aid and so on and so forth. I think that is a start. I think that is an adequate short-term solution, but I think that amount of money needs to be increased 10, 15, 20-fold or more. And I think they need to come up with short-term mechanisms to ensure safety and security of that funding getting to people who need it on the ground so they can conduct their everyday life, whether it be buying food, as I alluded to earlier, with winter coming, winter is there, winter is here. So therefore the electricity concerns, the heat, and the basic human environment and basic human needs, those needs to be addressed first. And I think whatever can be done to bring the key actors, international community, the Taliban, to the table for a discussion on these issues. But I think there has to be a recognition on the Taliban's part that they cannot run, if they want to be in charge, they cannot run their country this way, with the way that they're doing. And whatever international pressure needs to come to bear, I think that's fine. But there has to be some recognition on their part that this is not what you do to take care of a population that you want to be leading, plain and simple.
Yes, and I'll just note that they are collecting funds themselves. They have control of customs revenues and illegal trafficking. So they do have some of their own money that hopefully is being put to taking care of the population that they have control over. Katie, a last word. What would be some of those short-term options? I know you've elaborated them, but.
Yeah, sure. I mean, just overall, we need governments and institutions to take on more risk, right? I mean, right now, all of the risk is on the frontline actors, and that's the NGO community. And this can't go on anymore, right? So we need people to take some responsibility and shoulder some of this burden. So there's a collective approach to risk management here. And then most immediately, though, we need these legal safeguards to come through, right? So we need an additional protection through OFAC on education. And then we need the 1988 safeguard to come through as robust as possible in the format that I described it. Now, that will really help kind of lay the groundwork for access to cash and to be able to move forward. Until those things happen, we're going to be paralyzed. And so, policymakers, institutions, get your priorities straight, put your priority on the Afghan people, take on more risk, and provide the legal safeguards that the community needs to stay and deliver, as you all have committed to in terms of your own policies, including the Biden administration.
Thank you very much, everyone. There was a recent Treasury license about remittances. There are some electronic options, but the private sector, obviously, in my opinion, has to be a huge part of the solution going forward, because it is one of the things that was created over the last 20 years that could be a vibrant member of the community. Everybody, thank you so much for your thoughtfulness and for your continued activities and activism. And to the audience, thank you very much. There are lots of resources out there, including that congressional letter and other information that's coming out about the UN's activities. I strongly urge everyone to go and look at these different options, and for us all to put forward what we consider to be acceptable in Jason's terms, and can be implemented with urgency. That is what the people of Afghanistan deserve. Thank you all very much.
Thanks a lot, Annie. Thanks, everyone.